journey and being here, and actually that stimulation and the part that we can actually bring to people. The majority of the team, I think 19 out of 20, when we came to see Woman in Black and Manuel Mamassa, had never been to the theatre before. And I think that's, again, it's one of the things that actually makes us a bit unique and makes it successful, because it's about life and enjoying and being happy. So anyway, moving on to Professor David Best. When I first started, and it was thinking, right, well, it's a theory, this is an idea, how are we going to prove it, how are we going to show that it works? I remember speaking to Mark Gilman, I know Mark's in here somewhere, and I said, I'm going to need to get this evaluated. Who should I ask? Who do you think? And he said straight away, without hesitation, you need Professor David Best. He is world renowned about recovery. And I remember I was sat in a little office at the police station making my pitch to David to say, come on David, this is going to be a great project, you need to be evaluating it. And here we are 18 months later, and we've got a great working relationship, and it's just going from strength to strength. So over to you, Professor David Best. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Steve, for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I've been part of this journey. And I guess one of the things about being an evaluator or researcher with a project like this is you're supposed to remain completely autonomous, independent, and neutral about the project. And I feel none of those things about Jobs, Friends and Houses. I am a complete convert to what has happened here and what has been done. It's such a powerful process, and you know, I have a very privileged and lucky job. Well, actually I have two jobs. So I'm Professor of Criminology at Sheffield Hallam University, and I'm Associate Professor of Addiction Science at Monash University in Melbourne. So I split my working life between the UK and Australia, and much of my work has been about three things really. It's been about understanding how we treat addiction problems. It's about understanding how people recover from addiction problems. And it's about understanding how people desist from offending behaviour. And all three of these things kind of merge in some ways around this project. And I feel slightly lonely up here. It was great watching 50 or 60 people standing up here. Now I'm stuck here on my own, so you just have to kind of bear with me a little bit. And what I want to do is I'm going to really talk in two parts this morning. The first part of what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you about the background and the rationale and why this is such a problem and such a challenge. And then I'll tell you a bit about what Jobs, Friends and Houses has done to address that challenge, which bits have worked and which bits are still work in progress. This is a complicated issue. And the first thing I really want to say is part of my job is based in Sheffield, and I work at the Helena Kennedy Centre for International Justice. And when I came back to the UK from Australia for most of the time, I was very, well, as you can imagine, I really wasn't keen on working beside lawyers. You know, it's bad enough when you have to see one rather than work with 40 of them. But anyway, I moved into this area with some concern about how my work was going to fit around law. And it struck me that what was important about desistance and recovery is that they are fundamentally issues of social justice. That for people to make lasting change requires three significant component parts. Those parts are a personal commitment on a journey of change that involves the growth of self-esteem, self-respect, resilience skills, coping skills, communication skills. But they aren't enough, because they also require people to change their networks, their social contacts and social connections. And I'll say a bit more about that as we move on. And that we know from all the international research that the biggest predictor of how people manage to recover is when they transition from a network that's supportive of drinking and drug use to a network that's supportive of recovery. That's the single biggest thing Change who you're surrounded by, and people will learn new ways to cope, ways to behave, ways to relate to other people. But in doing that, by joining new groups, people learn that being part of that group carries certain rules and norms that enforce and enable those changes to be sustained. And so that's the second thing, personal change, then social change. But there's also a part for everyone in this room to do, because allowing people to change is a social contract. Essentially, if all of us say, we really don't believe in recovery, so we don't want former addicts or former offenders to live next door to us, to work beside us, to date our brothers or sisters, to live in our street, we are effectively engaging in acts of disintegrative shaming. We make people not able to reintegrate. And one of the unique things that Jobs, Friends and Houses does is it creates a platform that allows people back in, that reintegrates rather than disintegrates. And that's crucial to our role, our collective role in making change possible. I'm going to tell you some statistics about addiction and recovery, just to give you a sense of how complex and challenging a process it is. The average length of an addiction career is 27 years. And that goes from the first use of a psychoactive substance, which typically happens 11, 12, 13 years of age, through to when people typically get to 5 years of recovery, which we call stable recovery, which I'll explain in a little bit, which typically happens sometime around 40. Now, were it only the case that you could say on people's 40th birthdays they were recovered, my job would be much easier. These are averages, and there are all kinds of reasons why some people recover earlier and some people recover later. But what addiction has done, and the spread of addiction has done throughout society, is it's changed how we understand crime. Because through the 80s and 90s, when I was doing criminology as a student, the general understanding was 75% of criminals mature out by the age of 28. 28 was the typical desistance point for offenders. In essence, what addiction has done, heroin addiction, crack addiction, has extended the average criminal career by up to 10 years. And that's why criminologists, lawyers, judges are interested in this question of how do we get people out the other end? How do we get people out the other end? Well, we know that every single successful recovery process has 5 common characteristics. And there's an acronym. I hope you can all see the little red dot. But instead of reading the words, if you read down the way, that makes up the acronym CHIME. And CHIME stands for connectedness. You can't recover on your own. You cannot desist from offending on your own. You have to do it through other people, which some people might call friends. You have to have a sense of hope. And for any clinician who wants to inspire people to recover, any probation officer, prison officer, policeman, drug worker, alcohol worker, their first job is to help people believe that recovery is possible. Identity. People need a new identity, and one of the critical things that Jobs, Friends and Houses has done is to provide people with a new identity. The M is for meaning. Meaning is a sense of purpose and something useful to do. Some people might call it jobs. And the last one, E, is for empowerment. A sense of dignity, control over your life, and an opportunity to do things that are meaningful and engage in activities that give you a sense of value, a sense of purpose and power, control over your life. And all of this is embedded within a model which says, how do you best do this? You do this through peer programs and activities, because we know that recovery is a social contagion that spreads from one beacon of hope and success to another. Professionals have a critical role to play, but they are rarely sufficient. We know that of the things that work in recovery, mutual aid groups and peer processes are two of the three most critical things. And the third one, houses, a safe place to live, is a critical prerequisite to a recovery journey. So how many people recover? Of all the people who have a lifetime substance dependence, somewhere between 50 and 60% will achieve 5 years of stable recovery. And that's a crucial point. Now, you can either see that as a glass half full or a glass half empty scenario. So what it means is somewhere between 40 and 50% of people who are addicts will die as addicts. But more than half will recover. There was a lot of talk in the science of addiction in the 80s and 90s that what we had was a chronic relapsing condition and that nobody ever recovered. Well, we know now the science is really clear. And in my own work, I've gathered about 1,600 recovery stories in Scotland, Wales, England, and Australia. And what do we know about who recovers? I have spent years trying to find some magic ingredient and formula. The only rule is nobody recovers on their own. It's always a social process. Other than that, as far as I can work out, there's just huge personal variability in how long, through what, do you need treatment, do you need detox? It varies massively. But you need inspiration and you need other people. That's critical to recovery. For Sir Peter's benefit, this is a famous painting by Francisco Goya called Saturn Devouring His Son. Anyway, moving on. My largest ever recovery study was conducted in Birmingham and Glasgow, where we had about 400 people who were in recovery from alcohol or in recovery from heroin. And what we did was we tried to work out what the core characteristics were that enabled them to have good, positive quality of life in recovery. And there were two things that mattered more than anything else. One was the more other people in their social network that were in recovery, the better they did. The second one was, if you just added up the stuff they did in the course of a typical week, that was a strong predictor of recovery. So it didn't matter whether it was childcare activities, community group involvement, volunteering, education or training, or employment. The more things you did, the better you did. I was lying when I said this picture was for your benefit. The reason for this is that the secret to how people recover is a complex scientific acronym that stands for GOYA, G-O-Y-A. GOYA is one of those things you don't learn until you've done years and years of academic training. What does GOYA stand for? Get off your arse. The more you do, the better you do. And we got criticised when we first published this. We got criticised on the grounds of how do you know it's not the case that people who feel better are able to do more? So we conducted 2 further in-depth studies, and it became really clear to us that when people initiate meaningful activities, it kickstarts well-being. And one of the things that we now know, so one of the studies I'm involved in Australia is called an anhedonia study. And anhedonia means you don't get pleasure from things. It's the opposite of hedonic and hedonia. When people start recovery, they struggle to enjoy anything in life. And the reason for this, the neuroscientific reason for this is because during phases of active addiction, people have so abused their primary reward system, their dopamine system, the re-regulation of dopamine pathways, primary reward pathways in the brain, takes something like 6 months to occur. And in doing our anhedonia study in Melbourne, we interviewed one man who didn't know what was wrong with him. He went to watch his son take part in a school sports day, and his son won the race, and all the other fathers were very jubilant on his behalf. And afterwards he came out and said, you know, I knew I should have been really pleased, but I didn't care. It meant nothing to me. And he started thinking, what kind of hideous freak am I? And the answer is a perfectly normal person. Because if you've destroyed and damaged your dopamine pathway so much, you're not going to experience pleasure from any of the normal things. Food, drink, sex, holidays, television, for about 6 to 9 months. However, we know that if you start working, if you engage in meaningful activities, it kickstarts the re-regulation of your dopamine primary reward pathway. So the resolution of anhedonia is work. Do stuff and you re-regulate your neurochemical pathways much faster. So the point about this is, recovery is a process, it's not an event, it's a process that takes place over time. It's a process that takes place with 2 triggers: being surrounded by other people who are doing or who have done it, and doing things. Get off your arse. And what's more, we should all want to encourage this for some very good reasons, because it not only helps the individual in recovery, it not only helps their family, it helps society. A number of years ago, about 6 or 7 years ago, I was working in the medical school at Birmingham University, and I had a medical student who wanted to do some stuff on recovery. So I got her to go and interview a whole load of alcoholics. And I got her to give them the World Health Organization Quality of Life Scale. And what she did was, she interviewed this whole group of people, and then she looked at the scores on the quality of life for people more than 5 years into recovery. And the World Health Organization Quality of Life Scale measures recovery in 4 domains: your physical quality of life, your psychological quality of life, your social quality of life, and how happy you are with where you live in your neighbourhood, which is called environmental quality of life. And when she showed me the results, I said, no, you're a stupid student. How can it be possible that people in recovery have better quality of life than people who have never been addicted? But that is indeed what she found. People in long-term recovery have better quality of life, particularly satisfaction with their neighbourhood and satisfaction with their social networks, than people who were never addicted. And I published a book a couple of years ago looking at how the recovery pathways of drug and alcohol workers who are ex-addicts, and we found exactly the same thing. People in long-term recovery have better environmental and social quality of life than the general public. That's the scores down. This is the addiction professionals here. This is the Louise Hibbert student group here. And this is the average member of the public who's never been addicted. There is better quality of life. And why does environmental quality of life matter? Well, last year, we completed the first UK Life in Recovery survey, and we get 802 people in recovery to tell us about their quality of life and about their recovery journeys and recovery pathways. There's a whole load of stuff in this slide which is about why it's good for society. People pay more tax, they commit less crime, their families are better engaged. But I want to draw your attention to one statistic, which is this one, up in the top corner, which says 79.4% of people in long-term recovery volunteer or engage in community activities. And I thought, blimey, that's a lot. So I went and looked at what it was for the average member of society. And for the average non-addicted member of society, it's 39%. In other words, addicts in long-term recovery are twice as likely to be active participants in their own communities as people who've never had an addiction problem in the past. This led me to 2 conclusions. The first is, we are fundamentally wrong in our old-fashioned treatment theories of addiction. Recovery is not about getting people back to where they started from. And as most people in recovery will tell you, I don't want to go back to where I started from. That's why I started using drugs in the first place, stupid. What I want is something bigger and better. And what the last two studies show is that for people who manage stable recovery, 5 years or more of abstinent living, their well-being and quality of life is better than the average member of the general public, and they contribute more to their societies and to their communities. That's why it's not some kind of act of altruism to support recovery. It's in everyone's benefits, because the more people who make it to long-term recovery, the better connected and the better engaged and organised societies are. And that's a fundamental challenge. Moving on. It's always critical when academics do a presentation, there's one slide that means absolutely nothing to anyone in the audience, which shows how clever we are. So this is my attempt at it. This is a study we did in Melbourne with 150 teenagers going into specialist alcohol and drug detox. And this is called a pathway model. And you're bored enough by listening to me, so I'm not going to go through the statistics of this. The point about this study is, what we were looking at was who does well and how it links to their social networks. This was called the Youth Cohort Study. And this paper has just been published in the last week. And what we found was that if you're a young person who completes alcohol and drug treatment and you go back to the same social networks you had before alcohol and drug treatment, with very few exceptions, you relapse. And you've relapsed and returned to the same lifestyle within 6 months. So, there were two other groups of people. In the left-hand group of people over here, what they typically did was, they said, I understand that if I go back to my same network, I'm going to relapse. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to isolate myself. I'm going to shut myself away, not see any of my friends. I'm going to make my iPad and the telly my best friends, and I'm never going to leave my flat. And what we got, they were right. They managed significantly reduced offending and significantly reduced drug use. But what they did have in compensation for that was low life satisfaction, high levels of psychological distress, and high levels of social dysfunction. Only the young people who maintained the same size of social network but transitioned from networks that supported their offending or their drug use to networks that supported their recovery managed to show significant reductions in crime, significant reductions in drug and alcohol use, and elevated quality of life and well-being. This is not complex theoretically, but it's very difficult to do. And in essence, what I have tried to do in the course of the last 20 minutes or so is give you a quick overview of what we understand about recovery science and assistance science. It's a process that can be triggered or kick-started by professionals, but it takes place over time and is a process of personal growth, that requires the scaffolding of positive social networks and the engagement and approval of society. And for Blackpool, Lancashire, the UK, essentially they are decisions we have to make. We can take the American route of saying, when we catch people and we punish them, we effectively systematically exclude them, and therefore we just have to keep building prisons, we have to keep building our institutions and exclusions, and once you're out, you're out. Or we can try and go for a model which says, we reintegrate. We believe that recovery is possible, and we act in such a way that people are successfully re-engaged and reintegrated back into society. Steve and I first met about 18 months ago, and one of the things that when you hear about jobs, friends and houses, that people say is, well, isn't that obvious? Why don't we do that all the time? And the answer is because professionals, so-called professionals like myself, think that if we sit down with someone and flap our gums at them for 45 minutes once a fortnight, it's like sprinkling magic dust on people, and they go away and they get better. Isn't that clever? Except it doesn't work. It's complicated. I spent 3 years or so working in and around two inpatient detox wards at the Maudsley Hospital in South East London. Well, we actually had 3 inpatient wards. We had a short-term emergency admissions ward for alcohol, heroin and crack. We had an alcohol detox ward, and we had a heroin detox ward. And getting people clean is not complicated. Getting people to the point of detoxing out, virtually every vaguely clinically competent inpatient unit can get 75 to 80% of all its clients out the door successfully detoxed. Ours, a supposed national leader in drug treatment, roughly a quarter of them had relapsed within a day. The point is not getting people to sobriety. It's enabling them to maintain sobriety and build a meaningful, purposeful life. And that's the Jobs, Friends and Houses is not a detox programme. It is not an acute treatment provider. But what it is possibly the first UK project that we can evidence that takes those people relatively new in that journey, that 5-year journey, and can provide them with the scaffolding around them to sustain and maintain that process. How does it do it? Well, I'm not going to go through a lot of what Jobs, Friends and Houses is or does, because other people will do that today. Essentially, what it has done is to create a model that allows a clear, visible pathway of hope that provides people with a sense of safety and meaning through connection, through social learning, meaningful activity, and a process of change. But in doing so, it allows that process of change. And when we did the initial 6 month, the initial review, we had a very high non-relapse rate, and it's slightly lower now, as I'll come on to later. But essentially, we've had a very, very high success rate in our evaluation. And it does it essentially through the processes of creating that social network and social scaffolding that provides the two core processes of social control and social learning by building a recovery community that benefits, that, as with any attempt at a relational project, does 3 things. And one of the things that's hard about evaluating something like Jobs, Friends and Houses is you're trying to measure 3 things at once. Do people change? Do the people round about those people change? And does Blackpool change? And they were effectively the questions for us about measuring and evaluating this process. And one of the things we know, there's a really good evidence base in favour of recovery housing. So Oxford Houses is probably the best evaluated model of recovery housing in the world. And people who go into Oxford Houses, which essentially requires them to pay rent, do chores, obey rules of sobriety, and attend meetings if they want to, they show significantly better outcomes than virtually any other aftercare programme. There are at least a couple of international kind of near equivalents of Jobs, Friends and Houses. There's the San Patriciano community in Italy, and there's the Delancey Street project in America. But this is very much a first in UK terms. And one of the things that is challenging for people in early recovery is that stigma, exclusion and shame process. And it's one of the reasons why the 12-step fellowships are so appealing to many people, because they provide that anonymity and a support system that allows people not to be visibly identifiable. However, with Jobs, Friends and Houses, there was an alternative model. There was a high visibility around the process. This is a van, this is a sign, this is another sign, and this is an office. Oh, and this is a whole load of people. Right, okay. Why is Jobs, Friends? And these things matter. Because what Jobs, Friends and Houses has done, contradicting much of the previous science of what we did, was that it challenged the notion that people had to be low visibility or invisible. And you see all the people with their logoed stuff on today. And the visibility creates a social identity. And the social identity provides both a warrant of employment, a warrant of belonging, and an external marker of meaningful activities. And in terms of the kind of emergent science of how people change, it's not just about you changing, it's about other people accepting you are changing. And having these markers that provide you with a very visible indication that you are doing something different is a key point in that process. It's a collective social identity that allows people early on to buy into a vision, and a vision that is at once selfish and altruistic. You help yourself by helping others, by building a recovery community, by providing yourself with a trade and a profession. It provides houses, skills, jobs and pride, and their pathways to real jobs. And I think one of the things that came across very clearly in our evaluation work was that for people engaged with Jobs, Friends and Houses, there was a sense that this wasn't a kind of comedy social work process or a MAC job which had no dignity or value attached with it. This was something significant and salient and meaningful. And that as we want to start testing how people move forward with Jobs, Friends and Houses, the kind of question we wanted to say is, do people who start and continue do better than people who drop out of the process? So one of the core questions for us was, how do we compare well-being across the retained group and the dropped-out group? So what we found was that generally across most of the measures we took at baseline, when we followed people up 6 months later, they were doing better. That's great. But you get all those questions that then provokes about regression to the mean, and is that a real effect? And to some extent, we won't know these answers for much longer down the road. So these are preliminary findings for us. But what we have is, and again, I apologise for the numbers and the statistics, so let me just do a little bit of translating for everybody here. We have a group who didn't start off doing terribly badly across a whole range of measures of psychological health, physical health, quality of life, physical health adversities, recovery capital, which is really important, and recovery group participation. But if we look at people who are retained in the programme compared to those who drop out of the programme, there are consistent differences, some of which are statistically significant, and statistical significance is hard to achieve with a relatively small population. And just to translate that into another issue, so there were two findings for us. If you come to Jobs, Friends and Houses, the chances are you will be better off 6 months or a year later. But crucially, from our point of view, the longer you stay in Jobs, Friends and Houses, the better you do across a range of measures. So this is what we call dose effects. So it's not just the case of, if you come along, things are a bit better and you do a bit better. The longer you stay and the more actively you engage, it was associated with fewer drinking days at follow-up, fewer adverse health symptoms, better personal and social recovery capital, better quality of life, and crucially, a stronger bond, a stronger social identification with Jobs, Friends and Houses. Why does Jobs, Friends and Houses work? It works because people become bound into the programme. They buy into this vision of change. And by buying into this vision of change, they allow themselves to become regulated and controlled by their peers and by the organisation. They buy into a vision that enables and almost forces change on them over time. And they do it by changing who they spend time with. They change the number of people they spend time with, and they change the proportions and types of people they spend time with. People who are in Jobs, Friends and Houses do well in part because they are better connected. Nothing to do with alcohol or drug addiction. There is something called the social cure. We know that the more groups you belong to, the better your physical health and the better your psychological health. In a Public Health International study 5 years ago, better social connection was better for your life expectancy than stopping drinking, stopping smoking, or losing weight. Social connectedness to positive social groups is a predictor of morbidity and mortality. In other words, the more positive groups you belong to, the less ill you become and the less likely you are to die. And it matters more. Getting a new friend is better for you than stopping drinking, stopping smoking, or losing weight. This is not an advert on behalf of either the alcohol industry or the tobacco industry. The reason for this is what's called social capital. As you become connected to more groups, so you not only have more access to resources, you have more access to information, to support, to connections, and to protection against adversity. If your only groups are socially excluded, stigmatised groups, you don't have that support. And that is why changes in your social networks are a critical predictor of will you maintain sobriety, but also will you develop well-being and quality of life. Okay, so the next two slides, I think, are the two core bottom line findings from Jobs, Friends and Houses. So the first one is about offending. And this is, I guess, moving from slightly more esoteric research, scientific data, to really blunt, quantifiable data. Before joining Jobs, Friends and Houses, the clients had committed a total of 1,142 recorded offences, and 28 had experienced a total of 176 imprisonments. Since joining Jobs, Friends and Houses, a total of 5 offences had been recorded, resulting in charge. In other words, the averaged out annual offending rate has changed from 2.46 pre-joining Jobs, Friends and Houses to 0.15 since joining Jobs, Friends and Houses. This is a reduction in offending of 94.1%. This is a phenomenal effect. And along with one of my colleagues here, I've worked in adult drug treatment services for around 20 years. These kind of effects do not happen through professionally delivered addiction treatment services. What does that mean to the public purse? What it means to the public purse is the following 4 sets of reductions in cost to the taxpayer. Just to quickly sum that up, those are reductions in imprisonment costs, reductions in benefit claims, and the flip side of that, which is the payment of taxes, reductions in reoffending, and health and social care costs, which includes attendances at GPs, ambulance attendances, and emergency room admissions. All of which might be, so what, who cares about all that stuff? Essentially, in year 1 of Jobs, Friends and Houses, the total saving to the public purse has been £815,000. This is phenomenal. If we go with the estimate, there are roughly 250,000 addicts in the UK. I will assume your arithmetic is better than mine. If you get £815,000 savings from 45 people, that means your saving per person is roughly £20,000. If you multiply that by 250,000 people, I can't work it out. It's a lot. It's a lot of money saved. This just strikes me as an astonishing finding. And this is year 1. These are early effects. So, Jobs, Friends and Houses has managed to engage and retain a complex population and managed to engage sufficient of them for sufficiently long to create these effects in its first year of operation. The anticipated social savings as the organisation grows and as these changes become more embedded will only increase over time. This will be a very positive, steep trajectory of change. And we know partly why this occurs. And partly why it occurs is because of the complex embeddedness of the social networks and assets, not of individuals, but of the organisation. It's Jobs, Friends and Houses connectedness to multiple resources within the community. So in essence, what has Jobs, Friends and Houses as an organisation has done is the equivalent of what people with offending problems and addiction problems should do. It should be tap into positive resources in the community. So this is a great success for everyone here, and for the team, and for Steve and Matt and Shui and all of those people who have given huge amounts of time and effort to making this happen. This is a huge tribute to them. But much more than that, it's a huge tribute to Blackpool. To all those things in Blackpool, all those resources, sports, arts and recreation, recovery groups, mutual aid groups, peer groups, employment services, community services, all of those things that have partnered up and become part of the asset map of Jobs, Friends and Houses. Now, we've done this part. This diagram is a conceptual overview. The next one is not. This fabulous diagram, which I love, is an analysis of the Facebook page postings of Jobs, Friends and Houses. Now, I know several people in the audience are very proud of their contribution to this. Essentially, what we have done, we have very clever software that allows us both to create a social network analysis of all postings on Facebook, and also use a program called LIWC to do linguistic programming on the social network that's created. And what it allows us to show is that there was a transition from primarily staff-based Facebook activity to primarily client-based Facebook activity. And from science terms, and I'll show you how it changed over time. So these are months 1 to 5 of the social network of Facebook activity on Jobs, Friends and Houses. And what we know from this is that as people move from the periphery of the social network, in other words, Jobs, Friends and Houses clients who posted only occasionally, as they post more often and become nodes in their own right, their language becomes more positive, and their language becomes more representative and typical. In other words, they create recovery language. This is language as social control. As clients take over the postings on Facebook, so the posts become more positively recovery focused, and we can analyse every single post in the emotional content and the words used to determine both the connections and the impact of the connections. Now, that's just a kind of cunning little bit of science for you. But it allows us to start illustrating something we've known. And we were able to predict who does well on the basis of how positive their posts were and what likes there were and connections there were resulting from them. This is only the Facebook equivalent, because we can measure it, of what we know happens in real life. As people get brought into the community and become embedded in the community, so their values, attitudes and norms change, and they become the community becomes of significant value to them, and as it becomes of value to them, so the likelihood of them returning to using communities diminishes, and their recovery becomes embedded. It looks fabulously sophisticated, but it's not. It's about how people change groups they belong to that protects them from adverse social effects. To go back to a somewhat more basic overview as I come towards the end. One of the questions that has, I know, played in the heads of all of the JFH senior team has been around, is the model replicable? In other words, could it be reproduced in other places? And the initial setup involved a number of external grants and processes. And one of the things I think that's important to say is it looks like the time from the reliance on external money to kind of break-even point is round about 20 months. So in other words, beyond month 20, and this is still a learning process for everyone, not only will Jobs, Friends and Houses be producing an annual saving to the taxpayer of £800,000 a year, it will also be a self-sufficient business model that's sustainable over time. And this is critical to us understanding how Jobs, Friends and Houses can contribute and be replicated elsewhere. To summarise, Jobs, Friends and Houses provides huge savings to the public purse. It leads to massive reductions in criminal justice costs and acute health costs. It stimulates pro-social networks and a powerful sense of community. It challenges stigma and exclusion and generates a powerful, positive, pro-social social identity. And effectively what we have here, I think, is the first evidence-based post-acute recovery social enterprise that has replicability and reproducibility elsewhere. But what does this mean for Blackpool? What it means for Blackpool is a genuine sense that what has been created is a therapeutic landscape of recovery. A place where the endeavours of many of the people in the room have challenged stigmatisation, social exclusion, and have started chipping away at that disintegrative model. For Jobs, Friends and Houses to work, it makes Blackpool a better place, a better connected place, a safer place, and a place where there are much stronger, more positive social connections. Thank you.